This is Historic Blah, where the past comes alive in minutes. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and comment your city. I want to see where our history lovers are watching from. Story 1. The Papyrus Bureaucrats of Ancient Egypt. You are reclining under the soft flicker of an oil lamp. The night is quiet, save for the rustling of papyrus and the distant lap of the Nile against muddy banks. The year is around 1250 BCE, the reign of Ramesses II, and the hum of daily life in the Egyptian city of Thebes is focused not on battles or temples but on paperwork. At the heart of this bureaucratic empire were the scribes. Scribes were everywhere. They tallied livestock, recorded land boundaries, drafted contracts for marriages, disputes, and sales, while grand hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls told stories of divine pharaohs and celestial legitimacy. Most Egyptian writing was mundane: taxes, debts, census records, inventory logs. If you imagine ancient Egyptian life as all pyramids and priests, you're overlooking the flood of administrative labor that sustained it. And this work, this steady stream of ink and papyrus, was done by thousands of bored, overtrained men hunched at writing tables, scratching symbols into dried reeds. The House of Life. Much of this scribal labor happened in places called the Per-Ankh, literally, the House of Life. These were temple-adjacent centers for education and record-keeping. While they occasionally served religious functions, most of the time they looked more like dull government offices than mystical archives. Inside, a dozen young men might be seated in rows, practicing their handwriting over and over, line after line. A good scribe is attentive. Do not be idle. A lazy scribe brings shame to the House of Life. These weren't philosophical proverbs. They were copywork, like lines on a blackboard from a bored schoolboy. Scribes were chosen young, usually from elite or priestly families, and apprenticed for years. They memorized not only the vast catalog of hieratic signs, a cursive version of hieroglyphics used for day-to-day writing, but also templates for contracts, tax declarations, and labor logs. If they were lucky, they graduated into careers in regional offices or temple storehouses. If they were unlucky, they stayed behind to train the next cohort. Papyrus tax forms. One of the most tedious yet illuminating parts of Egyptian bureaucratic life was taxation. Everything was taxed: land, livestock, produce, beer, linen, fish, and all of it was documented. A typical tax form might read like this: Year 7, season of inundation, month 2, day 10. The tenant farmer Mimhat, son of Kai, declares. He holds 2 aruras of barley field in the district of Heliopolis. He yields 8 sacks of barley, and from these 3 are rendered as tax. Signed by Pentu, the scribe of grain quotas. This is not a dramatic document, and yet in such lines you see a system of control and balance. Egyptian officials didn't need to know what a god thought about Mimhat's barley. They needed to know how many sacks to expect and who would deliver them. They recorded this on papyrus sheets, bundled and tied, then stored in wooden chests labeled by region and year. A system of checkpoints. The bureaucracy was layered. First came the village counters, local scribes who interviewed farmers, tallied herds, and assessed taxes. Their records were passed up to district scribes, then to central archives. At each level, tallies were compared. This meant paperwork had to match. If Mimhat claimed to owe 3 sacks, but the district scribe recorded 4, someone was sent back to the village for clarification. To prevent fraud, scribes used consistent phrasing and numerical formatting. Errors were flagged not by elaborate audits, but by patterns. Did someone always underreport their flax yield by exactly 1 sack? A suspicious coincidence. Such dull scrutiny meant hours of rereading forms, comparing margins, checking the consistency of ink strokes. It was, to use a modern term, a paper trail. Scribes and social status. Despite the tedium, scribes were respected. They were literate in a mostly illiterate society, trusted by state and temple alike. Even though their work was numbing, it was also essential. Grain quotas helped prevent famine. Tax records determined state revenue. Marriage contracts ensured property disputes didn't turn violent. There's a famous Middle Kingdom instructional text known as the Satire of the Trades. In it, a father tells his son that being a scribe is better than any other profession. The potter is covered in clay, more than a pig in filth. The cobbler smells of hides. The boatman is soaked from prow to stern. But the scribe, he is clean, he commands, he does not carry burdens. What the text leaves out is how much time that clean scribe spent copying lists of sheep. The art of monotony. The monotony was not an accident. It was design. Bureaucracy thrives on repetition. One field inspected the same way as the next. One ledger recorded in the same format as 1,000 others. This regularity ensured stability. It also ensured burnout. Some scribes, we know, expressed frustration, though only obliquely. Marginal notes sometimes complain of errors from the mouth of the overseer, or this task again. A few scratched idle doodles of animals or boats into the margins of scrolls. One especially vivid papyrus, known as the Turin erotic papyrus, suggests that at least some scribes turned to graphic illustration when they had enough of grain tallies. There is something deeply human about this, trained minds bored into inventiveness. Bureaucracy as a survival strategy. Why did they do it? Because Egypt, more than many ancient civilizations, was a state of cycles. The Nile flooded. The harvest followed. The same fields were sown. In such a predictable world, administration became the means of resilience. By recording what was planted and what was owed, the state could store surplus during good years and allocate during lean ones. Temples became granaries. Scribes became the quiet architects of survival. And so, Mimhat's 3 sacks of barley recorded by Pentu, copied by district scribes, stored in a papyrus chest under the gaze of a temple statue, became part of a system that outlived empires. But did Pentu, seated on a dusty mat, know that? Did he care? You imagine Pentu again, his reed pen poised over a sheet of papyrus. He's not an architect or a priest. He builds no temples and speaks no sacred verses. And yet, the structure of ancient Egypt, its economic arteries and social skeleton, owes more to Pentu and his scribal kin than to any pharaoh's decree. This section of the story shifts from the scribes' daily routine to the broader consequence of their records. It is in the endless scrolls of barley yields, census lists, and labor quotas that we glimpse the mechanics of a civilization that lasted for over 3 millennia. Let us walk slowly through the corridors of ancient Egyptian administration. Temples as administrative hubs. When we speak of temples in Egypt, the word often evokes visions of gods, incense, and ritual. But most temples functioned more like government centers than places of worship. They were storehouses, treasuries, and banks. The great temple at Karnak, for example, held land, livestock, and armies of workers. Its wealth wasn't simply ceremonial, it was fiscal. And the scribes were its accountants. In Karnak alone, scribes documented everything from the weight of gold ingots brought in from Nubian mines to the weekly grain allotment for temple bakers. Their tools were simple reed pens, black and red ink, and papyrus, but their influence was immense. Each scribe contributed a piece to a vast system of economic balance. Their records told the state where to build, when to trade, and how to feed its workers. One overlooked reality of this setup is that much of the divine wealth of the temples was secular in practice. Gold offered to Amun still had to be counted, weighed, and assigned a value in state ledgers. Statues were sacred, but the workers who polished them had to be paid, and their wages had to be tracked. In this way, the scribes served both the gods and the grain silo. The scribal class, elites in the margins. While scribes weren't nobles, they weren't peasants either. They occupied an interesting middle ground, a literate elite nestled quietly into the machinery of governance. Access to scribal training was restricted, typically passed from father to son. The process was long and harsh. A student might spend years just learning to form characters properly, then additional years memorizing legal templates, temple formats, and numerical tables. One 12th dynasty text tells us, "The pupil is beaten, for knowledge is the whip's offspring." Once trained, a scribe had options. He could serve a temple, a noble estate, or the central government. A lucky few became recorders for royal expeditions, writing on ostraca, pottery shards, during stone quarrying missions or military marches. But most were assigned to inventory duty, counting baskets of onion or jars of oil. Still, this was a privilege. Peasants toiled in the fields, soldiers marched, artisans carved, but scribes sat in shaded rooms dealing in symbols and silence. Occasionally, their work even served as a quiet form of power. The quiet influence of record-keeping. In a society where literacy was rare, scribes held a unique advantage. They could shape the story. Imagine a land dispute, two neighbors arguing over where a barley field ends. A scribe, holding an old land registry, is called to consult. If his records are unclear, his interpretation may become law. If the document is missing, his summary becomes history. This wasn't corruption in the modern sense. Rather, it was the inevitable byproduct of monopoly over the written word. Scribes could nudge borders, delay taxes, or subtly alter inheritance documents. Most probably did not, but some likely did, and even more simply acted according to which official employed them. In this way, the boredom of routine bookkeeping quietly supported or shifted the balances of wealth and control. Scribes and the great projects. When you gaze at the colossal monuments of Egypt, pyramids, temples, obelisks, it's easy to think of stonemasons, engineers, and enslaved laborers. But at the heart of those efforts were administrators and scribes. Nothing was built without planning. Before the first stone was laid, scribes had already calculated rations for hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers. Logged tool distribution. Documented how many days each laborer served. Tabulated the types of stone required and their sources. Coordinated with temple accountants to ensure food, beer, and clothing supplies were maintained for the workforce. Entire teams of scribes accompanied quarrying expeditions into the desert. They wrote on limestone chips or sandstone flakes, often complaining about shortages or illness among workers. These ostraca have been found in the ruins of Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. One ostracon reads, "Scribe Pazer notes, 2 days missed by Nebwebin due to a scorpion bite, oil issued, bandage issued, absent on the 3rd day also." This is the kind of history that rarely makes textbooks, but it is history all the same. Labor ledgers and the lived economy. Egypt's economy was not a cash economy. It was one of labor and goods. Wages were paid in kind: barley, beer, oil, meat. Taxes were collected not in coin but in produce and services. And all of this had to be logged. The scribe was both a payroll officer and a welfare recorder. His scrolls captured debts, distributions, shortages. He tracked not only how much was due but what had been forgiven. One document details a grain shortfall during a poor harvest season. The regional governor forgave a percentage of the tax burden, and the scribe notes, "By decree of the overseer, 2 sacks remitted, owing to the rising water," a reference to the Nile's unusually high inundation. In another case, a worker is excused from duty due to illness. His fellow crewmen are assigned additional rations to offset his absence. The scribe adds a marginal note, "See prior record for similar." Through these documents, we see a surprisingly flexible administrative system, not always fair, not always just, but aware, at least, of the rhythms of nature and the fragility of labor. When paper outlives empire, many of the papyri that survive today were found not in libraries, but in garbage dumps. Scribes discarded outdated records, worn scrolls, and copied practice sheets. These ended up buried in dry sands where Egypt's arid climate did what libraries could not, preserved history through neglect. In some cases, a single discarded papyrus contains both a tax form and a student's doodle of a duck. Another mixes a fragment of the Book of the Dead with a clothing inventory list likely reused during training. For centuries, no one thought these forms mattered. But now, they tell us what life was really like, not for kings, but for counters of bricks and measurers of wheat. They tell us that administration was not just a support system for civilization, it was civilization. The Empire of Ink. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egypt was a superpower. Its reach extended into Nubia, Syria, and beyond. Armies marched, diplomats negotiated with the Hittites, gold flowed from the south. And yet, without the scribes, those quiet agents of record, the whole thing might have collapsed. Scribal records enabled logistics. Logistics enabled construction and conquest required, again, more scribes to track tribute, foreign laborers, and materials. In this way, the empire fed upon ink and repetition. Every shipment of cedar wood from Lebanon, every census of slaves from Cush, every shipment of incense to a temple. Each one was logged. Each one mattered. Or did it? What happened when the scribes stopped writing? When the ink dried and no one recorded the yield of fields, or the names of workers, or the surplus grain? What happens to an empire when its paper trail disappears? In the arid sands of Middle Egypt, long after the scribes had packed up their ink pots and the temple granaries had closed their shutters, the scrolls remained. Tucked inside clay jars, sealed wooden boxes, or strewn across refuse heaps, they waited in silence, faded, torn, abandoned, but still there. In this final section, we examine what happened when the scribal engine of Egypt faltered. Not suddenly, but slowly, like ink drying across a half-finished page. The empire didn't fall with fire and invasion, but with neglected ledgers, unpaid rations, and unrecorded harvests. We close with a reflection on how bureaucratic systems, for all their dullness, remain the quiet pulse of civilization. The late New Kingdom, fractures in the ink. By the time of Ramesses XI, the final ruler of the 20th dynasty, c. 1077 BCE, the administrative engine that once hummed with scribes and surplus began to sputter. The signs of decay were not dramatic at first. The palatial scribal schools still trained young men, temples still logged grain, officials still held scrolls in council meetings. But the scrolls began to tell a different story. Records from this period describe repeated shortages. Scribes note that workers were absent, not from illness but from hunger. Rations had not arrived. Oxen for field plowing had not been supplied. Granary inventories went unverified. In the village of Deir el-Medina, the very place where tomb artisans once recorded daily activity in obsessive detail, an extraordinary event occurred around 1159 BCE, Egypt's first recorded labor strike. The workers of the royal necropolis stopped building tombs for the pharaoh and laid down their tools. Why? Because their wages, grain, and beer had not been delivered in 20 days. Scribes recorded the workers' complaints. One, preserved on papyrus, reads, "We have come here because of hunger and thirst. There is no clothing, no oil, no fish, no vegetables. Send a letter to the pharaoh and to the vizier that we may be provided with our rations." Imagine the irony. A workforce trained to immortalize kings refusing to work because the scribes had failed to immortalize the food deliveries. And perhaps more sobering, the scribes recorded the strike but could not fix it. Lost papyrus, lost stability. The decay wasn't just physical, it was procedural. The rhythm of seasonal documentation, the very calendar of Egypt's agricultural society, began to fray. Without reliable records, temple storehouses misjudged reserves. Without trusted scribes, tax collectors grew corrupt. Without inventory checks, elite estates overstated yields and underpaid the treasury. The glue of bureaucracy consistency had dried and cracked. The climate, too, shifted. Recent studies of pollen and sediment cores from the Nile Delta suggest periods of drought and reduced flooding during this late phase. The predictable inundation, once the reliable base of Egypt's agricultural calendar, became erratic. Without water, grain yields dropped. Without grain, rations failed. Without rations, laborers refused to work. And without scribes faithfully recording every step, no one knew where the breakdown began. One marginal scribal note from the period reads, "The delivery has not come. The overseer says to wait. The men say they will not wait." There's no dramatic story here, just a list of complaints, but that's how systems collapse, not with a bang but with a backlog. The shrinking world of the scribe. The end of centralized administration didn't mean the end of scribes. Many continued to work, but for different purposes. Some found new employers in local temples or private estates. Their records became more inward-facing, focused on local affairs, minor trade, or religious dedications. Others kept copying the same texts, again and again, as rote practice or ritual continuity. You might ask, what good is a scribe when the state no longer functions? The answer is that scribes became record keepers of decline. They documented the shrinking sphere of Egyptian influence. They copied older, more prosperous records as if to preserve memory itself. In this way, the scribe shifted from being a tool of administration to a vessel of preservation. A practice sheet found from the Third Intermediate Period includes this sentence: "Do not trust the measure of men, but trust the writing of yesterday." Was it a proverb, a warning, a quiet sigh? Either way, it marked a change in tone. Bureaucracy without a bureau. As central authority fragmented, Egypt entered a phase of competing priesthoods, military warlords, and hereditary governors. Each held local power. Some even minted their own records. But what they lacked was scale. The brilliance of the earlier Egyptian state had been its uniformity of record. From Nubia to the Delta, a sack of barley meant the same. A land deed had the same format. A census, the same cycle. Now that unity dissolved. Local systems popped up like weeds, each with its own ledgers, formats, and procedures. What one temple taxed, another exempted. What one estate forgave, another punished. And for the scribes, it was both a blessing and a curse. They were still needed, but their work no longer connected across a vast, ordered network. It no longer flowed up into a single archive. The scribes, like the society they once organized, were now atomized. Echoes in the sand. Centuries passed. Empires came and went: Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each brought their own records, languages, and bureaucracies. Yet fragments of the scribes' world remained, not in monuments but in debris. The sands of Egypt, so merciless to invaders, proved merciful to paper. In Oxyrhynchus, a once insignificant city south of Cairo, archaeologists found a garbage dump filled with discarded papyri. Over 500,000 fragments, tax records, temple receipts, love letters, contracts, school lessons. Among them, scrolls from the late Egyptian scribes, buried beneath layers of later Greek and Roman documents. The layers formed a kind of quiet historical sediment, centuries of boredom, one sheet at a time. One such papyrus contains both a child's scribal exercise and a broken letter from a woman pleading for more oil. Even forgotten texts carried voices. Reflections on modern systems. It's easy to dismiss these papyri as relics of a simpler time, but perhaps they are mirrors. Modern states, too, are built on layers of record-keeping. We may use servers instead of scrolls, spreadsheets instead of ledgers, but the principles are identical. Document the flow of goods. Count the people. Track the labor. Control the surplus. Anticipate the shortfall. The fragility remains. A missed shipment, a delayed report, a false number in a budget line. These are not dramatic failures, but they ripple. The story of ancient Egypt's bureaucracy teaches us that systems don't fail because of invasions. They fail when no one updates the ledger, when rations aren't logged, when scribes go unpaid, when ink stops flowing. What the scribes left behind. In the final tally, the scribes of Egypt didn't write great poetry or philosophy. They didn't pen manifestos or revolutions. They wrote about barley. But their ink built a system. It fed cities. It balanced power. It preserved memory. It allowed one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations to endure through droughts, dynastic shifts, and decades of stagnation. And they left us accidentally the most complete picture of everyday life in the ancient world. Because they were bored, and because they were meticulous. In their boredom, they created continuity. In their tedium, they sustained order. In their pages, we see the outline of ourselves. Story 2. How the Han Empire counted grain, one scroll at a time. You are standing inside a vast stone building, dark except for shafts of dusty sunlight slicing through narrow windows. The air smells of dry husks and aged earth. Stacked in neat piles around you are thousands of woven baskets, each filled with grain, each carefully counted, logged, and guarded. You're not in a village market. You're in a state granary, somewhere deep in the Han Empire, around the 1st century BCE. This is not a tale of emperors or generals. This is the story of clerks with brushes, wooden slips, and tallies of millet of civil servants who, through sheer repetition, knit together one of the most powerful states in history. It is a story of how a quiet obsession with counting grain became the engine that powered roads, borders, armies, and peace. Let us begin with the grain itself. The currency of millet. In the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, grain was more than food. It was currency, tax, and political capital. Three main types dominated: millet, wheat, and rice, especially in the south. Millet, however, held a special administrative role, particularly in the north. Its compact, hardy nature made it ideal for storing and transporting, crucial in a time before refrigeration or centralized banks. In the Han state, taxes were often paid in grain. Officials were paid in grain. Soldiers received their rations in grain. The emperor's treasury included not only coinage, but warehouses full of grain tallies, rows and rows of inventory reports that detailed how many due, a unit of volume, were held in which district, at which time, and for what purpose. This gave rise to a sprawling bureaucracy, one focused not on conquest or conquest records, but on counting food. Wooden slips and official registers. Before paper became widespread, Han bureaucrats recorded information on bamboo or wooden slips, bound together with cords. These were the spreadsheets of their time: long, slender rectangles of bamboo, each etched with neat, orderly Chinese characters brushed in black ink. A simple shipment of grain might involve a dozen or more slips. One documenting the origin of the grain, district, field, harvest season. One recording the volume measured. One noting the recipient, official or warehouse. One indicating transport details, oxen, carts, timing. One filed for backup to be copied in the event of a flood, fire, or dispute. In a typical transaction, a local grain tax would be collected from peasants. It would be measured by the appointed official using a standard due vessel, tallied, and then escorted along with its wooden slip paperwork to the nearest administrative center. There, a secondary clerk would confirm the count. There was even a saying: the man who trusts one slip invites a missing grain. The bureaucracy trusted redundancy over speed, and so they copied, double-checked, and filed every detail. District clerks and the burden of precision. Han China was divided into commanderies and districts. Each had a set of officials responsible for the collection, registration, and forwarding of grain. These weren't noblemen or landowners, but educated clerks, many of them drawn from the Confucian scholar class. To become a grain registrar wasn't glamorous, but it offered a path to security. Success at this level might allow a clerk to rise to higher administrative posts or at least avoid conscription into the army. The day-to-day life of such a clerk was repetitive. Verify tax quotas. Measure grain deliveries. Ensure fair weighting. Corruption in scale usage was common. Record the names of all contributing households. Report discrepancies. Compile monthly reports. Failure to properly log grain deliveries could result in punishment, sometimes severe. Falsifying registers or misreporting weights was considered an act of fraud against the emperor. One unearthed wooden slip from the 2nd century BCE notes: Clerk Zhai did not record 7 due in the spring report. Let his stipend be reduced by half. Others hint at exile, beatings, or labor reassignment. This encouraged a culture of fearful accuracy. Boring, yes, but crucial. Grain storage, the imperial safety net. Why go to all this trouble? Because grain was the Han Empire's safety net. When harvests failed or rivers flooded or locusts devoured fields, the stored grain from state granaries allowed the government to distribute food, prevent riots, and maintain political stability. This was not charity, it was statecraft. The Han court maintained a rotating surplus of grain in strategically placed granaries across the empire. These stores served multiple purposes: emergency reserves during natural disasters, military supplies for campaigns, price stabilization in local markets by releasing grain when shortages inflated prices, debt forgiveness by occasionally redistributing grain after poor harvests. To ensure these reserves functioned, the clerk's paperwork had to be flawless. Even small errors in regional inventories could mean insufficient supplies for an entire district. This gave rise to increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic norms: regular audits, surprise inspections, standardization of measuring vessels, and even reforms that redefined what a due was in certain periods. The entire system depended on paper, or rather, slips. Voices from the slips, what the records say. Thanks to archaeological excavations, especially in sites like Juyin and Dunhuang in northwestern China, we now have thousands of recovered wooden slips. Many are dull by design. One slip might say, Autumn, Year 4 of Yangyuan, 324 due, received from Zhao District Tax. Another, seal of verification applied, count correct, Clerk Meng Su. But sometimes, buried in these repetitive lines, we find human moments. One clerk added a note in the margin: Supervisor's ox collapsed en route, grain load delayed, apologies forwarded to the head office. Another scrawled, Do not trust the carpenter's new due, it cheats by a half hand. These aren't grand historical speeches, but they remind us that history was shaped not only by emperors and edicts, but by daily decisions made with brushes and baskets. Centralized trust, decentralized labor. The genius of the Han grain system was in how it distributed responsibility across a massive landscape while maintaining central oversight. Each district managed its own collections, but every shipment was documented in triplicate sent to local offices, commandery hubs, and the central archive in the capital, Chang'an or later Luoyang. Errors could be cross-referenced. Falsifications were harder to hide. And yet the system wasn't immune to decay. In periods of drought or internal rebellion, regional officials sometimes falsified reports. If grain was stolen or lost in transport, it was not uncommon for clerks to adjust the numbers quietly, hoping the central bureau wouldn't notice. One imperial memo from Emperor He, c. 100 CE, directly addresses this. Let it be known that any who tamper with the counts shall be held as betrayers of the realm. The empire rests upon food as the body rests upon breath. Harsh words but accurate. A poorly administered grain system could provoke unrest, weaken armies, and cripple imperial legitimacy. Paper emerges, a new chapter in boredom. By the 2nd century CE, the invention and spread of paper began to transform hand administration. It allowed for longer records, faster copying, and greater storage efficiency. But it also posed new problems. Paper was easier to destroy, easier to forge, and harder to preserve in the humid southern provinces. Wooden slips persisted for some time, especially in legal documents and grain registers. One document found from the Eastern hand reads, "Let this paper record mirror the bamboo count. In case of discrepancy, bamboo holds truth." A fascinating detail. Paper was convenient, but trust remained in wood. The bureaucracy knew that boredom was sacred, and sacred things shouldn't be easy to alter. A life measured in dew. For thousands of hand officials, life was defined not by status or stories, but by counts of grain. They never saw the emperor. They never led troops or built palaces. They counted millet. They worried about their weight measures. They argued over the capacity of storage baskets. They rewrote slips if the ink smudged. And in doing so, they created something massive. A unified, literate, food-secure empire that lasted over 4 centuries. But as with Egypt, this raises a familiar question. What happens when a system built on wooden slips becomes too complex, too rigid, or too easy to manipulate? What happens when trust in the count fades? The strength of the Han Empire's grain system was in its scale. Its weakness, inevitably, was in the same. In this section, we explore what happened when that scale turned against itself. The same bureaucracy that once stabilized the realm slowly became a burden. And as the century turned, the system built on the careful counting of dew began to fracture under its own weight, ushering in uncertainty, famine, and political disillusionment. Let us begin not with a failed emperor, but with a broken register. The empty baskets of late Han. By the end of the Eastern Han period, circa 2nd century CE, signs of strain were everywhere. Recovered documents from the period speak not of abundance, but shortages, not of efficient governance, but mistrust. Clerks at the local level began recording shortages in their shipments. But unlike in earlier centuries, these shortages were often met with punishment, not understanding. A wooden slip from Luoyang, dated to around 170 CE, reads, "Tax 350 due, received 285. Clerk Feng reprimanded. Granary master questioned." The grain may have been lost in transport, or stolen, or never harvested in the first place due to drought, but the central administration didn't or couldn't adjust for nuance. The numbers didn't match. That was all that mattered. In earlier times, the clerks could annotate slips with explanations, and local autonomy allowed for minor discrepancies. But by the 2nd century CE, imperial authority had become more reactive and suspicious. The once respected scribal class now operated under suspicion. Were they hiding grain, bribed by wealthy landowners, colluding with granary officials? And sometimes, yes, they were. The rise of landed elites and ghost grain. As the central government weakened, wealthy families and local aristocrats began buying up land. They collected grain directly from peasants, often at harsh rates, and operated their own private storage facilities. They were technically subject to taxation, but many avoided it through bribes or ghost quotas. Ghost quotas were one of the first signs of bureaucratic breakdown. Here, how they worked. An official would report receiving the full grain tax, say, 500 due. In reality, only 300 due was collected. The official would keep the rest for himself or his patrons. The surplus was ghost grain that existed only on paper. Since registers relied on clerical honesty and central offices often lacked direct verification methods, this practice became widespread. The result? Phantom abundance. Scrolls said the granaries were full, the people said otherwise. When a drought hit or armies needed food, officials found empty baskets and overpromised inventories. Entire provinces reported plenty while starving. The famine of 174 CE. In the year 174 CE, the Han Empire experienced one of its worst recorded famines. The exact cause was a combination of poor harvests, locust swarms, and logistical failure. But the tragedy was not just in nature, it was in paper. Granaries that had been reported as full were, in fact, depleted. Emergency stores were missing or rotten. Rice and millet, logged in registers months earlier, had never been received or had long since been eaten. One surviving record from the capital notes: people scrape bark and eat roots. We opened the East granary, found it spoiled. The wood had rotted, the sacks had burst. Another written in faint ink: 2,000 sacks gone, the weight master executed. That execution didn't solve the hunger, but it served as a warning. Someone must be blamed when numbers lie. The clerks lose control. For much of Han history, scribes were trusted not just for their handwriting, but their moral standing. Confucian doctrine emphasized upright behavior and duty. A scribe was not only a technician, but a steward of integrity. But under pressure, and with real hunger spreading, many scribes became corrupt or resigned entirely. Some became hired recorders for warlords. Others fled cities for smaller villages, where record-keeping returned to bartering, oral promises, and local arbitration. Central oversight weakened. Bamboo slips became shorter, less detailed. Inventories grew vague. Grain counting, once the most precise function of the state, turned into guesswork. The empire's body was intact, but its circulatory system, its paperwork, had collapsed. Rebels in the records. As the bureaucracy failed to deliver food, rebellion grew. Most famously, in 184 CE, a movement called the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted across northern and central China. Ostensibly a religious uprising, it was fueled in part by economic despair. Peasants blamed local officials for hoarding grain. Clerks were accused of fabricating records, hiding reserves, or conspiring with elites. In some regions, granaries were raided, their contents shared among villages, often without any formal redistribution plan. One scroll fragment, written hastily, reads: "Warehouse of Shu attacked, clerks burned, scrolls torn, no survivors." The rebellion was crushed, but the damage lingered. Warlords rose, factions formed, and with each passing year the empire lost not just control of its people but of its ledgers. Attempts at reform. There were efforts to salvage the system. In 189 CE, a high-ranking official named Kai Yang proposed reforms to central record-keeping. He advocated for the use of standardized, state-issued paper over variable bamboo slips, the rotation of grain clerks every 5 years to reduce local corruption, the introduction of double seals, one imperial, one regional, to verify all tax deliveries. Some of these ideas were implemented in parts, but it was too late. The bureaucracy needed trust, and trust had eroded. A saying from the time laments: "The slip lies, the basket is empty, the scribe bows, the people starve." Reflections in the ashes. We tend to view ancient China as a place of grand philosophy, endless dynasties and poetic culture. All true. But the Han dynasty's greatest strength was its paperwork, its careful tracking of food, its methodical approach to governance, its belief that the state could regulate society with consistency. That faith eroded, slowly, piece by piece, slip by slip. Grain registers became political weapons, inventories became propaganda, and people starved, not because the land failed, but because the records failed. It is a sobering thought. So, what happens to a civilization that cannot trust its own numbers? What if the words on a page say abundance, but the earth under your feet says famine? In the stillness after collapse, when the scrolls have yellowed and the tallies have stopped, something strange often remains: the idea of the system. The Han dynasty ended not with a clean cut, but with fragmentation, warlords rising in place of centralized governance, provinces spinning into semi-autonomy. But the bureaucratic principles that once counted every grain of millet didn't vanish. They mutated, they survived, and in some surprising ways they endured into the modern world. In this final section of Story 2, we look at what the Han grain-counting bureaucracy left behind. The institutional habits, the obsession with administrative order, and the understanding dull, but essential, that civilization is carried not by declarations or temples, but by receipts. What survived the fall? Though the Han imperial house collapsed in 220 CE, the bureaucracy it had built endured under its successors. The Three Kingdoms period, 220–280 CE, though chaotic, still relied on similar administrative structures. State-run granaries remained a critical tool of regional stability. Warlords who once dismissed court ritual now desperately mimicked Han grain policies. Registers, slips, and inspectors became tools of military logistics. Later dynasties, especially the Tang, 618–907 CE, and Song, 961–279 CE, would build upon Han models of bureaucratic grain management, albeit with improvements, like broader use of paper, printed forms, and merit-based clerk examinations. What's important here is that even after empire, people still believed in the system. They may have distrusted individual clerks, they may have seen corruption and fraud, but the concept that food needed to be counted, documented, and stored centrally remained solid. And that is the quiet genius of Han governance. Bureaucracy as culture. We often treat bureaucracy as a structure, a machine, or hierarchy, but it's also a mindset, a way of understanding the world through process, records, and responsibility. In Han China, this culture took on a life of its own. Over time, ritualized documentation became a kind of secular sacred practice. Whether counting grain, registering a land sale, or recording a birth, the act of recording itself was seen as civilization in action. By the Tang dynasty, scholars would look back at the Han not just as a military power, but as a model of administrative excellence. They admired not its emperors but its clerks. One Tang historian wrote, "Their swords rusted, their borders faded, but the records remain. In these we see the spine of their greatness." This idea that a society is measured by its paperwork may sound lifeless, but it's deeply human, because beneath the numbers you find real lives. Small moments on slips of wood. The recovered bamboo slips from Han granaries tell us not just about millet and inventory, they reveal what daily work felt like. One clerk writes, "The oxen are tired, the count was slow today." Another notes, "Let the record show, Liu Gui's grain was damp but acceptable, he offered apologies, no penalty." These are not great literary works. They're not poems or declarations. They're small, forgotten sentences written by men with brushes, kneeling over tables, performing the same task thousands of times. But through them, we see a world where routine held meaning, where a smooth inventory was a good day, where the absence of error was cause for quiet pride. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Bureaucracy as a survival strategy. Why did Han rulers build such a meticulous grain system? Because the real threat to empire wasn't rebellion or invasion, it was unpredictability. Floods, droughts, locusts, migration. These were the crises of the agrarian world. And in the absence of modern science or rapid communication, the best defense was an elegant bureaucracy. If you could count it, you could prepare for it. If you could register it, you could claim it. If you could record it, you could recover it. That was the promise. And though the system eventually collapsed under its own weight, it saved millions from starvation during its height. It allowed surplus to be redistributed across vast distances. It slowed the rise of inequality, at least for a time. In a world balanced precariously between harvest and hunger, that mattered. Echoes in modern governance. The ideas pioneered by hand-grained bureaucracy remain visible today. Redundant documentation to prevent fraud. Local record-keeping tied into central archives. State grain reserves for disaster relief. Meritocratic clerk selection through exams or qualifications. Fixed units of measurement to standardize trade. You'll find these not only in China, but across the globe in ministries of agriculture, tax departments, and logistics offices. And in each of them, there is a faint echo of a bamboo slip etched by hand, passed from village to office, sealed and copied with care. Even the term paper trail owes its soul to these early systems, except theirs were slip trails, long, dusty lines of bound wood, linking farmer to emperor. What the scribes did right. It's tempting to see the hand system as bloated or flawed, but it was, in many ways, extraordinarily modern. It acknowledged that people forget, so records must remember. That corruption happens, so systems must check. That hunger is political, so food must be counted. That trust is earned, so process must be transparent. These ideas feel timeless because they are. A return to the counting room. Let's return for a moment to the original image. A clerk, sitting on a woven mat, brush in hand, recording grain from a long line of carts. He is not noble, not powerful. His name may never be remembered, but in that moment he is performing the act upon which his civilization rests. He is writing slowly, carefully the number 267 due. It's a dull number. It won't change the world. But if it's written wrong, the wrong amount will be shipped. Someone may go hungry. Someone may be punished. A decision far away may be based on that number. And so he checks his count again. And again. And then he records it, knowing that this line will disappear into the bureaucracy, that no one will thank him, that his ink will fade. But the act, the process, the discipline that will linger. And if someone, centuries later, uncovers his slip and reads it, perhaps they'll understand. This is how history survives, not in glory, but in grain. Story 3, the Sumerian Audit, Clay Tablets and Lost Receipts. Before there were empires, there were ledgers. Long before alphabetic scripts or papyrus scrolls, before paper and parchment, and long before the Romans devised laws and hand bureaucrats counted dew of grain, there were small clay tablets baked, inscribed, and stacked in cool temple rooms along the riverbanks of Mesopotamia. These tablets, etched in an early system of writing called cuneiform, didn't record myths or poetry, at least not at first. Instead, they logged livestock counts, barley rations, beer allotments, and labor shifts. This story is not about heroic kings or architectural wonders. It's about the proto-accountants of Sumer, who, sometime around 3100 BCE, began pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay to manage the tedium of administration. In doing so, they did something extraordinary. They created history's first known system of bureaucracy. the city that needed receipts, Uruk, 3100 BCE. Imagine Uruk not as ruins in the sand, but as a living city. The air is filled with the scent of baking bread and brick dust. Canals glisten under the Mesopotamian sun. Temple complexes bustle with workers, livestock, and administrators. Somewhere inside the Ina temple precinct, a young man sits cross-legged on the floor, a damp clay tablet resting on a reed mat in front of him. He's not a priest or warrior. He's a scribe. And he's not writing poetry. He's recording that 47 jars of beer were delivered to the temple granary this morning, and 12 went missing last week. This is what civilization looked like in its administrative infancy. Why writing began with accounting. You might think writing began with literature, but historians and archaeologists overwhelmingly agree writing began with numbers. Before 3000 BCE, the Sumerians used small clay tokens to represent goods, cones for grain, spheres for animals. These were stored in clay envelopes bully, sometimes impressed with marks to show what was inside. Eventually, they skipped the tokens and began marking directly into clay tablets. The first written records weren't stories, they were inventories. A typical early cuneiform tablet might contain symbols for a pictograph of a cow, a number 5, a location or temple name, a brief note on the purpose, sacrifice, ration, or storage. It was the Neolithic version of a spreadsheet. These scribes were the world's first data analysts. Scribes, seals, and surplus. The Sumerians lived in a world of centralized storage and redistribution. Farmers grew grain, raised livestock, or fished often under the authority of temple estates. These goods were brought to the temple, where officials recorded their arrival and later reallocated them to workers as rations. The system depended on trust, and trust depended on documentation. That's where the scribes came in. They were trained to count goods arriving at the temple, verify weights using stone standards, track outgoing rations to workers, record losses, spoilage, or theft, stamp documents with cylinder seals, a personal signature rolled in clay. One recovered tablet from Uruk lists, 12 measures of barley to the brewer, 5 to the temple guard, 1 missing. Another from Lagish records, 2 oxen delivered to the priest of Ningirsu, seal of Gudea applied. These clay receipts were baked hard in the sun. Once hardened, they couldn't be altered without breaking. This was a security measure, a fraud-resistant form of filing. Not dramatic, perhaps, but revolutionary. The boredom of standardization. As cities grew, record-keeping expanded. Every major Sumerian city, Uruk, Lagish, Nippur, developed its own scribal schools, archives, and bureaucratic customs. But over time, a kind of standardization emerged. Scribes began to use uniform signs for goods, numbers, professions, and places. The clutter of pictographs became a sleek, stylized script, cuneiform, made by pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into wet clay. The system was surprisingly efficient, but incredibly dull. One scribe might spend an entire day writing the same combination. 1 basket of grain, 1 basket of grain, 1 basket of grain. But monotony had power. Standardization allowed clerks in to read tablets from Nippur. It allowed regional governors to send resource reports to the capital. It allowed supply chains to span river systems. Civilization is made of repetition, and Sumerian scribes knew it. The temple as a bureaucratic machine. The heart of record-keeping in Sumer was the temple. In early Sumerian cities, temples didn't just handle worship, they owned land, employed laborers, ran breweries, and collected taxes, usually in the form of goods. They functioned like corporate states. Each temple had granaries for barley, storehouses for wool, beer, fish, and meat, workshops for textile production, clerks and scribes to track it all. Cuneiform tablets from these temples reveal dizzying amounts of detail. Daily rations, 2 liters of beer and 400 grams of bread per worker. Livestock births and deaths, 7 piglets born, 2 died, 5 survive. Wool allocation, to the weavers of the house of Ningal, 30 spools. Nothing was too small to log. One tablet even records a lost lamb with a note, expected to return by next full moon. Whether it did, we'll never know, but the fact that it was recorded tells us everything. Training the recorders. To become a scribe in Sumer was a long, disciplined process. Boys likely from elite or priestly families began their training in the Adaba, or tablet house. There, they practiced making signs, memorizing numerical systems, and copying administrative forms. Some early practice tablets include lists of animals, ox, sheep, pig, goat. Standard phrases, X delivered to Y. Scribe mantras, the pen is stronger than the plow. Scribes were drilled in discipline, not imagination. The goal wasn't to innovate, but to replicate. Their job was to ensure consistency in a world increasingly reliant on centralized storage and long-distance trade. It was a world made of clay and counting. When tablets disagree, despite its structure, the system wasn't flawless. Some tablets conflict, some are duplicated, some contain corrections, crossed out lines, or added notes in different handwriting. These weren't mere copy errors, they suggest disputes. One tablet reads, "Received 20 jars of oil, correction actually 18, clerk Eridu erred." Another includes a marginal complaint. Scribe Lugal Kalama has not returned tablet 2 of 3. Request immediate copy. We begin to see that even 5,000 years ago, bureaucratic frustrations were alive and well. Clay cracked, clerks bickered, inventory went missing. In a way, it's comforting. Why these records matter. The world's first writing was Homer or Confucius or the Vedas. It was a note that said, "This goat belongs to the temple." And while that may seem unpoetic, it marks something remarkable. The moment humans began to externalize memory, to put knowledge into fixed, shareable form, to build a network of trust that could stretch across time and distance. It all began with someone pressing a stylus into clay and counting a basket of barley. But here's the question that lingers. What happens when the clay tablets go unread? When the temple closes, the storehouse burns, or the scribes disappear? Who remembers the goat then? Who remembers anything? Imagine a tablet, cracked but legible, dug from the sands near ancient Lagash. The wedge-shaped cuneiform symbols read, "2 oxen lost to illness, recorded by Nanasin, awaiting replacement." The tone is clinical, practical, but beneath that brief message is the outline of a civilization straining to keep itself together through accounting. In this second part of our story, we follow what happens when a highly structured record-keeping system, arguably the earliest of its kind, began to crack under its own weight. The scribes of Sumer, who once turned barley into bureaucracy, now faced the limits of their systems: administrative redundancy, inconsistent oversight, political centralization, and the age-old foe of all empires, famine and fraud. Paperwork and power in the early dynastic period. By around 2600 BCE, Sumerian cities had blossomed into powerful urban centers: Lagash, Nippur, and others, each with towering temples, intricate canal systems, and an expanding bureaucracy. Temple archives now held thousands of tablets, each a fragment of logistics: lists of sheep births, rotations of herders, fish deliveries, brick allocations. But more cities meant more competition, and more competition meant more need for control. To centralize authority, rulers like Urukagina of Lagash and Lugaltsatesi of Umma began expanding their administrative arms. This involved appointing overseers of scribes, creating multi-tablet audits with cross-reference seals, holding periodic temple inventories, sometimes taking weeks, instituting rotating scribal checks across storehouses. At first, this strengthened order, theft declined, rationing improved, regional output could be tabulated with impressive accuracy. But something unexpected happened. The more layers of clerks and copyists added, the slower the system became. Discrepancies multiplied, and instead of clarity, temple administrations began drowning in their own clay. Bureaucratic overload, the tablet crisis. At the height of its scribal efficiency, Lagash reportedly stored tens of thousands of clay tablets in organized archives. Some rooms may have contained more clay than food. These archives grew faster than they could be verified. One archaeologist described a temple archive room as a warehouse of unanswered questions. Why? Because as record-keeping expanded, so did the need to record the records. Some tablets existed purely to say that another tablet existed. For example, Tablet A delivered 40 baskets of barley. Tablet B, copy of Tablet A. Tablet C, receipt confirming copy of Tablet A was filed. This recursive record-keeping created layers of oversight that no longer ensured efficiency. They generated delay and masked errors. In one recovered case, two nearly identical tablets show conflicting numbers. One says 16 jars of oil, the other 14. No correction was added, no reconciliation filed. As scribes became more focused on the rituals of record-keeping than the contents themselves, the system became brittle. And into that rigidity came a far greater problem: environmental collapse. The salted earth, environmental decay and economic strain. Southern Mesopotamia was fertile but fragile. It relied on intensive irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Over centuries, however, constant watering without proper drainage caused soil salinization, the buildup of salt in the earth that gradually destroyed agricultural productivity. By around 2100 BCE, records from cities like Ur and Ummah show a shift from wheat to barley, a more salt-resistant crop. Shortly after, even barley yields dropped. A tablet from Nippur reads, "Fields once sown with grain now yield empty stalks, granary short by 30%. The administrative system, built to manage abundance and control distribution, was now being asked to sustain survival in an age of famine. Instead of allotting rations to workers, scribes were now cutting them. Instead of counting oxen for field plowing, they were logging oxen deaths." Another tablet recovered intact documents. Shortage of bread, temple workers dismissed, clay tokens returned, record ends. That final phrase, "record ends," is especially haunting. There's no next tablet. The process simply stops. Clerks and corruption, the human element. Faced with mounting pressures, many scribes did what pressured officials have done in every era. They cut corners, adjusted figures, or looked the other way. Multiple audits from the late Ur-III period, c. 2100–2000 BCE, show increasing evidence of fabricated entries, missing shipments, and unverified returns. One clay document from the city of Drehem, near Nippur, claims 62 oxen were received. A subsequent audit counts only 45. No explanation. Another tablet, filed years later, reads, "Regarding the oxen discrepancy, Scribe Dumuzilu is no longer in service. No trial, no explanation, just removal." Trust in the scribal class began to wane, and as record-keeping lost its aura of sacred precision, the temple's authority began to erode. It's no coincidence that around this same time, palace-led governance began to rise, and temple economies lost primacy. Where once the temple was the heartbeat of logistics, now the king's storehouse began to assume power. The collapse of a system. By the end of the Ur-III period, c. 2000 BCE, Sumerian civilization faced a multi-pronged collapse. Ecological decay had made grain production unreliable. Over-centralization of bureaucracy stifled flexibility. Corruption and fraud hollowed out trust in record-keeping. External invasions, notably by the Elamites and Amorites, disrupted trade and administration. The system of temple-based redistribution powered by tablets, sealed and stamped, simply couldn't keep pace with crisis. In response, some cities burned their archives, perhaps out of necessity or desperation. Others abandoned temples altogether. Granaries stood empty. The scribes scattered. The administrative network that once held city-states together, one tablet at a time, fell silent. What was lost and what wasn't? The tragedy of the Sumerian collapse wasn't just war or drought. It was the loss of continuity. Thousands of receipts, records, contracts, and inventories went unread. The bureaucratic memory that had sustained society for centuries gone in a generation. But not all was lost. Later civilizations, Babylonian, Assyrian, and eventually Persian, rebuilt and adapted the cuneiform system. They adopted scribal education, improved legal formalities, and refined audit structures. They even wrote training manuals for scribes. In this way, Sumer's bureaucracy became an inheritance, not a failure. The tablets, buried and forgotten, would one day speak again. A system made of clay. Unlike ink or paper, the Sumerians' choice of medium clay meant that even discarded documents could survive millennia. Many of the tablets we read today were originally trash. One of the most significant archive finds at Ebla was discovered in a collapsed storage room, where the fire from the destruction of the city actually baked the clay harder, preserving thousands of texts. Among them, tax lists, delivery schedules, personal notes from scribes, and audit reports of temple offerings. In their dullness, they preserved the texture of ancient life. So we must ask, what does it mean that the first true writing system was created to count livestock and bread? And what do we lose when no one counts anymore? The last of the Sumerian tablets didn't end with declarations. They ended with lists. Baskets of barley, wool disbursements, oxen transfers. Not poetry, not eulogies, just the final notations of a civilization that understood perhaps better than many that followed that to govern, to feed, and to survive, one must document. In this final section of Story 3, we close with a reflection, not only on what the Sumerian bureaucracy achieved, but how its quiet innovations formed the foundation for everything that came after. While temples crumbled and kings vanished, the clay tablets endured, and with them, the DNA of bureaucracy itself. From cattle to contracts, the evolution of the tablet. Sumer's earliest tablets were simple, pictographs of livestock, numbers, and commodities. But by the end of the Ur-III period, c. 2000 BCE, cuneiform writing had evolved into a flexible, multi-use script capable of recording not just inventory, but law, correspondence, and literature. The shift was significant. What began as an economic survival mechanism, a way to track grain, slowly became a universal writing system. And the scribes who once counted sheep and measured grain now wrote legal contracts, hymns to gods, royal edicts, mathematical problems, astronomical observations. But the root of all of it, the format of the administrative tablet. Even the Great Code of Hammurabi, written a few centuries later, circa 1754 BCE, was composed in cuneiform, etched like an eternal ledger on basalt, but drawing its structural ancestry from the temple inventory list. The scribe becomes an institution. The scribe in Sumer wasn't just a profession, he was a pillar of society. Scribes advised kings, mediated disputes, interpreted tax records, preserved religious practices. Most were male, drawn from elite households and trained over years in formal tablet schools, often beginning in childhood. A clay fragment from a scribal school, likely a student's rough practice, includes: "He who keeps clean the stylus and steady the hand shall know the king's words." Scribes often signed their work. Sometimes they included complaints or reflections. One left this behind on the bottom edge of a delivery report: "The sheep bleated, the guard slept. The count was wrong, I rewrote it again." You can almost hear the sigh. And yet, through thousands of such mundane corrections, the Sumerians built the administrative capacity to manage multi-city networks long before roads were paved or metal currency was standardized. Bureaucracy as a form of memory. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Sumerian ledger system was its memory function. Before writing, cultures relied on oral memory. Laws, traditions, inventories, debts all passed down by word and repetition. But in a growing urban society, that wasn't enough. You couldn't rely on a priest to remember how many jars of sesame oil had been delivered 3 summers ago. You needed a record. And so Sumer developed one. It changed the very nature of accountability. Now, a person or institution could be held responsible not by memory, but by inscription. If a shipment was missed, the tablet said so. If a field was taxed twice, the tablet could reveal it. In this way, bureaucracy became a form of justice, not moral or philosophical, but practical. It offered evidence, consistency, continuity. Even the gods, according to later Akkadian and Babylonian myth, were imagined to have scribes in their service, recording deeds and destinies on celestial tablets. Such was the power of the administrative mind. Echoes in later civilizations. The Sumerians fell, but their systems echoed far beyond their time. Babylonians adopted and refined the scribal class, adding more complexity to contracts and standardizing formats across broader regions. Assyrians built royal libraries filled with both literary and bureaucratic tablets, including full records of crop yields, slave purchases, and war supplies. Persians used Aramaic and cuneiform scripts for taxation systems, stretching from Egypt to India. Greeks, encountering Mesopotamian cities, adopted many aspects of temple finance into their own public record-keeping. The idea of citizen registers and the public treasurer's scrolls has roots in these early Mesopotamian practices. And even today, modern financial and legal systems are built atop ideas that first appeared in temple inventories. Ledger-based accounting, signed receipts, permanent, non-editable records. The presumption that data matters more than reputation. From cuneiform to cloud storage, it's all part of the same long lineage. The tablets speak again. In 1850, a British traveler named Austin Henry Layard excavated the ruins of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq and uncovered what would become known as the Library of Ashurbanipal, over 30,000 cuneiform tablets. Most were not royal decrees or religious hymns. They were tax records, grain distributions, census data, personnel lists. The rediscovery of these texts in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed a profound truth. What survived of Sumerian society was not its myths, but its memos. When scholars learned to read cuneiform, they weren't first enchanted by stories, they were buried in bureaucratic details. And slowly, through these details, a civilization came back into focus, not as legends or ruins, but as a network of relationships, goods, problems, and solutions. One tablet at a time. A quiet reflection. So what do we learn from all this? That the measure of a society may not be in its monuments, but in its filing systems. That the most durable traces of civilization may be its dullest because boredom is repetitive, and repetition creates pattern. and pattern when etched in clay endures. A Sumerian scribe pressing stylus to tablet in 2350 BCE did not imagine that his delivery report would be read 4,000 years later. He likely hoped it would be read once, filed, and forgotten. But his work persisted, and from his tiny, forgotten desk, a habit of mind was born, a way of managing uncertainty, preserving memory, and linking one life to the next through notation. A civilization built of dust and clay survived because someone wrote it down. Story 4. The Venetian notary who recorded nothing of note. You are sitting at a desk in a narrow office just off a cobbled Venetian alleyway. The walls are lined with boxes of yellowed parchment, each labeled with a date and a name. A candle flickers on the ledge beside a shuttered window, throwing soft shadows across a dull, leather-bound ledger. Outside, gondolas cut gently through the green water of the Grand Canal. There are masked balls, spice merchants, rumors from Constantinople. But inside, your job is simple. You are a notary, and your task today, like every day, is to witness, copy, and file a contract for the sale of salted fish. Welcome to the quiet, essential world of the Venetian notarial clerk, where the power of empire ran not through warships or merchant caravans, but through paperwork. What is a notary? In Renaissance Italy, especially in the Republic of Venice, the notary was a legal recorder, a professional witness, and a custodian of civic order. He was neither judge nor lawyer, but without him, very little could happen. Want to buy land? Need to secure a dowry? Selling wool? Sending your nephew to apprentice in Crete? A notary must write it down, sign it, and seal it. Notaries were everywhere. In small towns, they worked from home. In cities like Venice, they occupied desks in the Rialto district, nestled among bankers, brokers, and scribes. They were hired not to make decisions, but to formalize them. And in doing so, they created one of the largest, most detailed bureaucratic archives in all of early modern Europe. The mechanics of nothing special. A notarial act was not meant to impress. Its value was in its mundanity. Each document followed a near-identical format. Date in both Venetian and Christian calendars. Names of contracting parties, including fathers' names. The transaction's nature, sale, loan, marriage, apprenticeship. Terms of agreement. Payment schedule, if any. Penalty clause. Signatures or marks. Official notarial seal. A simple agreement to deliver 15 barrels of olive oil from Puglia to Venice might take 3 pages. One document recovered from the Venetian archives begins. In the year of our Lord 1491, on the 10th day of April, I, Giovanni de Pieve, licensed notary of the most serene republic, do witness the agreement between. And then line after line of measured legalese, followed by. Should the barrels arrive cracked or spilt, the penalty shall be 6 denarii per vessel. It's not thrilling, but it mattered. Licensing the ledger. To become a notary in Venice required formal training and official licensing. Most notaries studied law at a university, often in Padua, Bologna, or Ferrara. They mastered Latin, legal vocabulary, and contractual structures. Then they passed an exam before the Avogadori de Comune, the state's legal overseers, received a seal, and were entered into the register of practicing notaries. This system ensured uniform formatting, legibility, recognition in court, continuity across decades of legal culture, and yes, boredom. Because the goal was not to entertain or innovate. It was to persist. A document had to be decipherable 70 years later, long after both signatories had died. It had to be unremarkable. That was its strength. Storage in the state. Every notary was required to maintain an archive of his work. Some kept bound ledgers. Others stored individual contracts in labeled boxes. By law, copies of certain categories, wills, property deeds, dowries had to be submitted to central repositories in the Doge's palace or other public offices. This meant that by the 1500s, Venice had accumulated hundreds of thousands of contracts, most concerning nothing but daily life. Historians today pore over them to learn about fish prices in 1472, apprenticeship terms for glassmakers, marriage dowries in working-class neighborhoods, loans for spice cargo from Alexandria, testaments of plague victims. Each document alone is dull. Together they form a map of survival, a record of how ordinary people lived, worked, died, and passed things on. A day in the life of Giovanni, the notary. Let us return to our notary, Giovanni de Pieve. His typical day begins just after dawn. He opens his shutters, sharpens his quill, and prepares his ink. Outside, vendors shout about anchovies and apples. Clients arrive sporadically. A widow comes to revise her will. A merchant delivers a letter from Ragusa requesting legal acknowledgement of a contract. A journeyman weaver wants his apprenticeship registered. Giovanni listens, writes, asks for clarification, reads it back, stamps it. He is not a judge, but he knows the law. He is not a priest, but he hears confessions. He is not a writer, but he crafts sentences that will outlive him. He rarely speaks in public. He never sails abroad. But in his tidy ledgers, the entire life of Venice unfolds. The power of the pen within limits. Despite his low profile, the notary held quiet power. Because if a transaction was not recorded, it didn't happen, at least not legally. This meant notaries could refuse to validate suspicious deals, delay filings to create pressure, leak contract details to interested parties, illegally, but often profitably. Many were trusted mediators. A notary's neutrality, earned over decades of reliability, made him essential in business and family disputes. One archival fragment from 1534 shows a notary's margin note. Witness hesitant, repeats details inconsistently, document paused. Another reads, entered under protest, client warned of risk, witnessed by shop neighbor. This level of quiet integrity gave notaries the social capital to stabilize economic life, even when Venice faltered under plague, fire, or foreign war. The most boring documents that matter. Notarial records don't tell us what Venice dreamed. They tell us what it did. They show us the weight of flour in daily purchases, the value of a barber's tools, the terms of employment for a wet nurse, the distance, by contract, a porter agreed to carry crates of wine. These records, ignored for centuries, now serve as one of the most important data sources for scholars of the early modern Mediterranean. Why? Because no one lied to a notary, at least, not successfully. The penalty was too high, the language too precise, the reputation too vital. In the sea of confetti that is early history, notarial records are the anchor. So we must ask, if a man spent 40 years recording fish sales and dowries and debts, but never created anything original, did he leave a legacy? What is history made of, heroes or clerks? In the silent chambers of the Venetian state archives, there are drawers filled with wills, thousands of them. Each one written in the same careful, repetitive hand, each one signed by a notary, witnessed by neighbors, and sealed with wax. The subjects are long dead, the names mostly forgotten, but the words remain intact, organized, legal. Venice was a city of canals, merchants, and masked carnivals, but it was also a city of documents, and nothing revealed a person's true standing financially, socially, spiritually quite like their last will and testament. This section explores the power of these records, not only as legal devices, but as historical artifacts. In them, we see how notaries quietly became the archivists of the soul, and how death, for the Republic of Venice, was just another bureaucratic formality. Death by the book. When a Venetian citizen felt death approaching, whether from plague, age, or sea travel, it was customary to summon a notary. The will was dictated aloud. The notary would record the following: the date and location, the full name of the testator, including lineage, a declaration of mental soundness, bequests of property, money and objects, appointment of heirs or executors, optional pious donations to a church, monastery, or hospital, requests for burial location or prayers. The notary, ever methodical, would ask clarifying questions. Do you intend that the property at Campo San Polo go to your daughter or to her issue? Do you wish the silver cross to remain in the family or to be given to San Zanipolo? And the scribe would write, word by word, until the will was ready. A final line, hoc est meum ultimum testamentum, signaled the end. Witnesses signed. The seal was pressed. The act was complete. The notary's eye into daily life. Because wills were so formulaic, many seemed dull on first glance, but their details speak volumes. They tell us what people owned: a copper kettle and its wooden ladle, the red cloak from Ferrara, 3 books, one with Latin verses. They reveal priorities: my second best bed to my wife, but the canopy to my niece. To my son, the keys to the warehouse and debts owed by Signor Matteo. They reflect anxieties. If my son is not returned from the sea within 2 years, his portion shall go to the convent. They even record guilt: to the orphanage of the foundlings, in memory of what was taken. And notaries wrote it all patiently, without judgment. They were quiet historians, gathering final words that no one thought would matter centuries later. Dowries, contracts of trust. Another major task for notaries was the drafting and registration of dowries. In Venice, dowries weren't just family customs, they were legal instruments. A dowry represented a woman's economic identity within marriage. It determined her social status, her financial security if widowed, her family's standing in society, her children's inheritance claims. A notarial dowry contract could span multiple pages and include itemized values, jewelry, clothing, linens, property, payment schedules from the bride's father, the husband's responsibility to match or preserve the assets, terms of return in case of death, divorce, or abandonment. A contract from 1478 reads, for the marriage of Isabetta de Canergio and Lorenzo di Bartolomeo, a dowry of 150 ducats, 1 woolen bedspread, 3 robes, and a gold crucifix are recorded. And it continues for 4 pages, covering repayment schedules, arbitration clauses, and witness statements. Notaries had to ensure legal clarity, because dowry disputes could lead to lawsuits or worse, social scandal. These contracts weren't romantic. They were binding financial partnerships. And once again, the notary was the essential middleman. Registers of nothing special. Notarial registers could contain thousands of acts, sometimes covering decades of service. They were arranged chronologically, with no index and little commentary. One might include in order: lease agreement for a vegetable stall, apprentice contract for a carpenter's son, power of attorney for a merchant heading to Aleppo, last will of a dying widow, declaration of debt forgiveness, dowry return clause after a husband's death. Each was written with the same tone. The notary's quill didn't discriminate. A 6-ducat loan was as formal as a 600-ducat estate transfer. In doing so, the notary preserved equality of legality, if not equality of wealth. The role of witnesses. Every notarial act required witnesses, often 2, sometimes more. Their names were recorded in the act, along with their relation, neighbor, friend, colleague. This practice confirmed the testator's intent, protected against forgery, created a civic obligation to truth. Witnesses were not just a legal formality, they were embedded in the social fabric. In some neighborhoods, witnesses appear repeatedly, suggesting strong local networks. In other cases, notaries note that witnesses were illiterate but known to be honest, a reminder that trust often mattered more than education. And still, the notary wrote. Plague and the surge of ink. Venice suffered numerous plague outbreaks, notably in 1575 and 1630. During these periods, the volume of notarial activity skyrocketed. People rushed to write wills, contracts were revised, loans were canceled, dowries were renegotiated. Entire families visited notaries together, hoping to finalize affairs before contagion reached them. One record from the plague of 1630 reads, "In the house of Benedetto Grimani, 4 testaments taken in a single hour. The notary departed with haste." Others bear hurried notes, written on the stairs, as the testator refused to enter the room. Notaries risked their lives to continue their duties. Some died mid-recording. Others wrote through open windows, using gloves and vinegar. Even in pestilence, bureaucracy persisted. Forgotten but found. For centuries, notarial registers languished in damp drawers, unused and unread. Some were lost in fires or floods. Others were mislabeled or bound into furniture during wartime shortages. But in recent decades, archivists and historians have rediscovered them. A forgotten dowry register revealed the economic strategies of 15th century widows. A ledger of wills showed how merchants funneled wealth into convents to secure spiritual redemption. A series of trade licenses uncovered the presence of women traders working under male relatives' names. Each of these findings emerged not from grand chronicles, but from quiet stacks of parchment, recorded by men who never imagined they were chronicling history. They thought they were recording contracts. They were, in fact, capturing a civilization. So we ask, is the notary a mere copier of human agreements, or is he a sculptor shaping the very memory of a people? And if no one reads these documents again, do the lives they recorded ever truly end? A forgotten drawer, a curled parchment, a name long erased from headstones, still legible in the black iron gall ink of a Venetian notary's ledger. The record is dry, unmoving, perhaps a simple sale of timber, or a guardianship claim, or a will's final clause giving 3 ducats to a cousin no one remembers. And yet that document is proof. A life existed here. A transaction happened. A decision was made and recorded in full, in legal Latin or early Italian, by a man with a quill and a seal, sitting beside a shuttered window in a back alley near the Grand Canal. This final section closes the story of the notary not in grand gestures or climactic revelations, but in the slow realization that these men, while recording nothing of note, became the unacknowledged architects of collective memory. The archive as a living system. The Republic of Venice, by the 1600s, had become a city of archives. Almost every official act, public or private, produced a document. Notarial archives were not kept in a dusty, backroom sense of the word. They were maintained, referenced, and reviewed. A citizen disputing an inheritance might cite a will written 30 years earlier. A merchant re-entering the city after long years abroad might reclaim property thanks to a notarized act stored under his family's name. Each record, though limited in scope, was part of an enormous living system, a memory machine. And the notary was its mechanic. When the system worked, imagine this scenario. A merchant dies abroad. His widow returns to Venice, unsure of her legal standing. She brings an old contract. The notary opens his register. He finds the marriage record with the dowry terms. Then, from another year, the property lease. Then the merchant's power of attorney, granted before departure. Finally, the merchant's will filed just days before he sailed. Piece by piece, the notary reconstructs the family's legal status. Assets are released, guardianship is granted, a lawsuit is avoided. No drama, no courtroom oration. Just ink, paper, procedure. And trust. When the system didn't work. But bureaucracy, even at its best, is not immune to human flaws. Some notaries were careless. Others succumbed to pressure from the powerful. A few disappeared with their registers altogether, especially during plague outbreaks or periods of political turmoil. One 17th century case involves a notary who sold off property under false pretenses, using forged contracts. He was caught, tried, and imprisoned, but the damage, legal and social, lingered for decades. Families fought over inheritance claims tainted by his actions. Another record, barely legible, includes a cryptic line. This document copied from a lost original, the first having burned in the house fire. These incidents remind us, even the most robust paper systems can falter. But overall, the Venetian notarial network endured with remarkable consistency and clarity for nearly 5 centuries. Legacy in layered ink. Today, Venice's notarial archives fill miles of shelving. In quiet rooms behind the marble walls of the Archivio di Stato, box after box holds contracts for salt deliveries, testaments from plague years, apprenticeship agreements, land leases on lagoon islands, loan securities, promissory notes, property divisions. Each one tells us very little on its own, but together they form one of the richest historical records of ordinary life in the pre-modern world. And they exist because of men whose job was not to create history, but to record it. The irony of forgetting the recorders. Notaries rarely wrote about themselves. Their names appear at the end of documents, modestly. Witnessed and written by me, Benedetto di Pietro, public notary of the parish of San Moise. There are few biographies, few portraits, few letters of personal reflection. They left behind tens of thousands of documents, but almost nothing about their own thoughts. They ensured that others would be remembered, while they themselves were erased by anonymity. This anonymity wasn't accidental, it was part of the job. The notary was a vessel, a tool of legality, not ego. He had no voice in the documents, no opinion, just precision. And yet, paradoxically, his work preserved more voices than any poet or historian of the time ever could. Reading between the lines. When scholars read these documents today, they are not just interested in their legal content. They look for social attitudes, economic pressures, linguistic shifts, the changing roles of women, the evolution of professions, the texture of daily life. For example, a dowry contract that names a woman as her own financial agent, an anomaly worth studying. A will that leaves money to a child born out of wedlock, hinting at social complexity. A grain lease that lists 3 consecutive years of crop failures, revealing environmental stress. All of it hidden in plain sight, between the lines of what appears to be nothing of note. A closing image. Picture, if you will, a Venetian notary in winter, 1621. The air smells of cold stone and candle wax. Outside, gondolas drift beneath gray skis. Inside, at a narrow desk, the notary dips his quill, smooths a sheet of parchment, and begins another contract. The client is a baker, passing his business to his son. No one will remember this act. No one will study this man. And yet, somewhere perhaps in a scholar's hands centuries later, that very contract will provide the last known trace of that bakery's existence. It will show when it closed, what it earned, who it served, and the name of the man who wrote it. His handwriting careful, his Latin crisp. his work as always uncelebrated. So we end with one final question. What is the value of a life devoted to recording others? And in the end, are the most boring jobs the ones that leave the longest shadows? Story 5. A day in the life of a Roman census clerk. It is the 2nd century CE, and you are standing beneath a marble portico in the provincial town of Augusta Raurica, near the outer reaches of the Roman Empire. The air smells faintly of olive oil, limestone dust, and a hint of manure from the stables nearby. In the shade of the colonnade, a line of citizens waits: farmers, merchants, widows, each clutching a small wax tablet, a parchment scroll, or simply their memory of property and names. You, a census clerk, are seated behind a wooden table. You hold no sword. You bear no armor. You wear no senatorial toga. Yet the papers you handle today will shape taxes, military service, and public benefits for the coming 5 years. This is the census, Rome's great mechanism of population control and resource allocation, and at its heart is not glory, but bureaucracy. The census as a system. The Roman census, from censor, to assess or judge, was first instituted during the Roman kingdom under King Servius Tullius, but by the imperial era, it had become a vast administrative undertaking that reached from Britannia to Judea. It was held roughly every 5 years, the lustrum, and aimed to count the number of Roman citizens, determine taxable wealth, assess military eligibility, update legal and civic standing. It was both a logistical challenge and a display of state power. And it required an army of clerks, most of whom left no names behind, only lists. Roles and hierarchy. You, as a census clerk, sensuales, are part of the lower echelons of the bureaucracy. Above you sit the censors, the high-ranking magistrates once elected to oversee the census in the Republic. By the imperial period, many duties of the censors were delegated to local procurators and provincial governors. But the counting, the listing, the meticulous recopying of data, that's on you. You serve in the office of the tabularium, a public records repository, and travel, when needed, to provincial towns with your writing tools. A stylus for wax tablets, a reed pen, calamus, and ink for parchment scrolls, a knife for sharpening, a cord for bundling tablets, sand to blot and dry the ink. You are not celebrated, you are not feared, you are merely necessary. The form of a declaration. When a Roman citizen approached your table, they were expected to declare the following: full name, tria nomina, and any registered dependents, property owned, land, livestock, slaves, sources of income, workshops, trade, number of children, used to determine privileges or taxes, marital status, status of citizenship. The clerk's job was to record the declaration, verify the information if needed, and enter the details into the census registers. Some declarations were copied onto wax tablets, others onto papyrus or parchment, depending on the region and importance. The information was bundled by region and social class, then forwarded to regional archives or sometimes to Rome itself. A sample census entry from a surviving fragment reads: Gaius Julius Rufus, aged 43, of the tribe Claudia, declares. Land, 15 Eugera in the region of Ariminum. Slaves, 4 named. Children, 3 ages 17, 14, 9. Assets, oil workshop and wine press. Wife, Livia, citizen of Roman status. Signed on the 10th day before the calends of June. The formula never changed. Repetition was law. What the census was really for. The stated goal was population accounting. But in reality, the census was a tool of control. It allowed Rome to tax accurately. Wealth and property were assessed to calculate the tributum tax. Enforce military obligations. Those of certain wealth brackets were eligible or expected to serve. Monitor legal status. Freedmen, slaves, provincials all were categorized. Track family lines. Inheritance, citizenship, and marriage laws depended on correct registry. Without the census, Rome's imperial machine would seize up. It was the lifeline of the treasury, the military, and the courts. And it depended entirely on clerks getting the math right. Challenges and complaints. Your job as a clerk is rarely easy. Peasants lie about land. Merchants underreport income. Widows forget details. Slaves pose as freedmen. Some citizens don't show up at all. And when they do show up, they argue. You are under pressure from your superiors to keep the records clean, and under pressure from locals to look the other way. One fragment from Vindolanda, a Roman fort in Britain, includes a clerk's letter. The smith claims 4 slaves but pays for 2. The record cannot be trusted. He threatened me with the magistrate's favor. In some towns, bribery is common. In others, clerks are beaten or driven off by mobs if they demand too much. And yet the work continues. The bureaucratic ritual. After a round of declarations is completed, you and your fellow clerks organize the entries into lists. These are copied again and sometimes tripled, one for local use, one for the governor, one for archiving. The paperwork is wrapped in linen, sealed with wax, and stored in the public tabularium. The process is slow, dull, backbreaking, and it happens empire-wide. From Gaul to Judea, from Egypt to the Danube, thousands of clerks repeat the same process, filling Roman storage rooms with the quiet hum of quantified life. The clerk's view. Unlike generals or poets, you see the structure of the empire, not its glory. You know how many children were born this year in the province of Gallia Narbonensis. You know which towns have more widows than married couples. You see the names of freedmen slowly overtaking those of noble patricians. You see wealth concentrating in fewer hands as large landowners declare ever larger estates. And you record it. Without comment, without judgment. Just pen to parchment. Bureaucracy as identity. To be Roman was to be registered. You could not marry legally, inherit, join the legions, or even be buried in certain cemeteries unless you were on the rolls. This is why many people falsified status claiming Roman citizenship when they were not entitled. The infamous Emperor Caracalla in the 3rd century would eventually grant citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire, partly to simplify tax collection. But in your time, the line still matters, and the job of guarding it falls to men like you. Not soldiers, clerks. So we must wonder, what happens when a society grows too large to be counted by hand? When the names blur and the ledgers overflow? Can an empire survive when its clerks can no longer keep up? The sun hasn't risen yet over the decumanus of a provincial Roman town, but the census office is already awake. Behind the wooden counter, you arrange your tools, parchment scraps, leaden seals, small bowls of ink, a damp sponge to soften dried papyrus. The room is dim, lit by a few oil lamps. Dust hangs in the air like an unspoken truth. Today will be a long day. You are a census clerk, a low-ranking but indispensable cog in Rome's administrative machinery, and you are about to spend the next 14 hours copying, checking, verifying, and occasionally pretending not to notice when a declaration doesn't quite match the truth. In this section, we step deeper into the mundane mechanics of Roman enumeration, exploring what it meant to record an empire that was simultaneously vast, suspicious, and obsessed with classification. Paperwork or parchment, the physical burden. You may imagine ancient clerks surrounded by scrolls in grand libraries, but in reality, most of your working materials are ordinary and limited. In wealthier regions or cities, census declarations are written on. Papyrus, imported from Egypt, expensive. Parchment, made from sheepskin, more durable but laborious. Wooden tablets coated in wax, common in military zones and for short-term notes. Each material has drawbacks. Papyrus cracks in cold. Parchment warps in heat. Wax melts near lamps. Storage is a nightmare. You tie tablets into bundles with twine, wrap scrolls in cloth, mark them with wax seals or written tags. Files are kept in shelves or terracotta jars in the tabularium, often with little to no indexing system. Want to find a specific declaration from 10 years ago? Good luck. But the law says it must be kept, and so it is. Not for convenience, for control. The people behind the numbers. Most of your day is spent listening to declarations. Here are some of the people you encounter. Crispus, an aging cobbler who insists his shop is now worthless because the young don't know leather from bark. You write down his inventory, barely changed from 5 years ago. Flavia, a widow who can't remember if her husband's land was legally transferred before his death. She has no paperwork, only the memory of a dying whisper. You mark the transfer as pending verification. Lucius, a grain merchant, who declares only 2 slaves, though your own eyes saw 4 carrying sacks into his villa just last week. He offers you a coin for your silence. Marcus and Julia, a couple from a nearby village who didn't register their twin sons when they were born 3 years ago. They're nervous, afraid this omission might cost them a future inheritance. You record it all. You don't argue, you don't correct. You write what they say, unless it contradicts a prior record. Then you pause, raise an eyebrow, and ask for clarification. But only once. Fraud, fear, and fines. Census fraud is common. People misrepresent wealth, status, or family members. The reasons vary. To avoid taxation. To escape military conscription. To secure grain doles or citizen rights. To evade inheritance laws. In some cases, the fraud is obvious. A man claims 5 eudra of land, but forgot he made a formal donation to the temple last year recorded in another register. In others, it's subtle. A freedwoman registers as a full citizen, omitting her former status as a slave. It might go unnoticed unless a future legal case requires verification. If caught, the penalties vary. Monetary fines. Reduction in social class, infamia. Loss of citizenship. Rarely criminal charges. As a clerk, you are not an enforcer. You are not even a judge. But your silence or diligence can shape lives. The ghost entries. Sometimes the opposite problem arises. Absences. Entire families who vanished. Men who died in war but were never struck from the rolls. Children who should have aged but seemed frozen in time across 5 censuses. You call these the ghost entries. The record shows they exist. The town says they don't. Do you remove them? No, that's not your role. You annotate. Not found, possibly relocated or deceased. You've written that line so many times it now feels like a prayer. The burden of accuracy. Your work, while dull, is under scrutiny. Local magistrates expect clean summaries. Governors want tallies for tax quotas. Rome demands totals that match quotas. Too many citizens. It means more grain is needed. Too few. It raises suspicion of evasion or revolt. The pressure falls on your shoulders. Some days you round the numbers to make the columns match. Not enough to change policy, just enough to avoid extra questions. You tell yourself it's still the truth. Close enough. And after all, you're not the one making the decisions. You're only holding the pen. Census and citizenship. One of the most fraught declarations is citizenship. After the Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE, Nearly all free men in the empire were declared Roman citizens. But in your time before that sweeping change, citizenship was a privileged legal identity. Citizenship determined access to Roman courts, exemption from certain taxes, right to marry legally, right to own property, military eligibility, and every declaration of citizenship must be verified. You've seen forged documents. You've seen men coached to pronounce Latin names in a Roman fashion. You've seen local elites argue over obscure clauses from previous censuses. And you've written it all down, often with a silent shake of the head. It is a peculiar truth. The more bureaucratic a society becomes, the more identity is measured by paperwork, not character. Census data and empire-wide decisions. The emperor will never read your lists, but your numbers will help shape road construction in a growing province, military recruitment quotas, grain shipments, legal reforms. The bureaucrats in Rome will collate totals from across the empire. They will plot charts. They will send edicts. They will act with great confidence, based on data you collected. And you know better than anyone that some of it was wrong. But no one asks you. Closing the ledger. As the sun sets, you close the last scroll. Your hands are stained with ink. Your back aches from the wooden stool. You seal the day's declarations with wax and pack them for the next courier to the capital. You think about the people you recorded today. Will their names mean anything in 10 years? Will their declarations be used in court, or will they vanish into storage? You don't know. You only know that the empire depends on your work, and that no statue will ever bear your name. You are a census clerk. You are the hidden backbone of order. So we must ask, what becomes of a people when their names are recorded more carefully than their fates? And if a number is miscounted, does the person behind it cease to exist in the eyes of the empire? The records are quiet now. They rest in bundles, wax-sealed scrolls, and stacked wooden tablets filed behind stone walls in some provincial tabularium whose roof leaks when it rains. The census is over. You, a Roman clerk, have returned to your modest lodging, a rented room above a bakery that always smells of overdone barley bread and ash. You've spent the last 6 months counting lives, measuring people, scribing fates. And now there is nothing left to do but wait for the next lustrum, the next enumeration, the next season of scribbled truths and soft lies. But this final section isn't about the day-to-day. It is about what remains when the paperwork survives, but the people do not. It is about the long afterlife of ink. The clerk as historian unwittingly. You never intended to be a historian. You weren't paid to remember. You were paid to write things down. But across the centuries, your records outlast the empire itself. Long after the legions fall, after the marble crumbles, after the temples are sacked and repurposed as churches or barns, your census registers remain. They become the evidence for what once was. The population of Roman Egypt in 138 CE. The number of slaves in a Gallic villa. The rate of tax in Judea under Hadrian. The number of children declared by a Thracian farmer. You didn't know it then, but you were writing the history of ordinary life, a history Rome's poets, generals, and emperors largely ignored. They sought glory, you sought accuracy. Only one left behind the complete map. A glimpse from the future. Thousands of years later, in a modern university archive, a historian unrolls a Roman census return retrieved from a dry Egyptian tomb, written in Demotic Greek and Latin. She squints at the line. Apollonios, age 57, son of Demetrios, flax weaver, wife Timaretta, children 3, slaves 0. Just another entry, just another line. But from this line she reconstructs. Economic class. Local industry. family structure, linguistic patterns, urban-rural migration. She uses your record to breathe life into the bones of the past. And Apollonios, long forgotten even in his own village, exists again for a moment. Because of you. When bureaucracy becomes legacy. Rome, like every great state, believed in immortality through administration. Its buildings would fall. Its gods would fade. Its borders would contract. But its records, those mundane census rolls, tax declarations, manumission statements, would become the skeleton of ancient reality. And that makes you the clerk, the true custodian of civilization. Not the emperor, not the consul. You, with your reed pen, your cracked wax tablet, your aching wrist. The beauty of boring things. There is a strange kind of reverence that historians feel when reading a Roman census return. It's not grand, it's not poetic, but it is profound. It is the beauty of order, of a system that cared perhaps too much about measuring every field, every coin, every child. Of a world that saw identity not in the soul, but in the ledger. It's tempting to mock that, to view it as cold or impersonal. But would we even know these people existed without it? Would we know how they lived? Or that they loved? Or that they owned 2 goats and 3 amphorae? The invisible voices. The census was more than numbers. It carried invisible voices. A freedwoman's shaky admission that she now owns property. A farmer's hesitation when listing only one surviving child. A young man's declaration of Roman citizenship, proud but fearful it may be challenged. You heard them all, and wrote them down with dispassion, as instructed. You were told not to care, but you did. Sometimes, in the silence of your cramped office, you wondered, did the children listed have enough to eat? Would the taxes leave the family poor? Would the young men live through their military service? You never wrote those questions, but you felt them. Death of the clerk, survival of the word. Eventually, like all men, you died. There was no monument. Your name was not carved into the stone of the tabularium. You were replaced by another clerk, who copied the next census and the next. But your writing survived. In a dry vault. On a scroll. Tucked into the ruins of a town forgotten, even by local shepherds. And centuries later, when archaeologists found your census bundle and carefully unfolded it, they read the entries not with boredom but with awe. Because every line meant someone had lived. And you were the one who made that truth permanent. A closing thought. Rome's greatness was not built on marble alone. It was built on paperwork, on names, on numbers, on declarations made in nervous tones to a man behind a desk who simply nodded, dipped his pen, and asked, "And how many eugera of barley this year?" It is not a glorious question, but it is the one that preserved a civilization. So as we close the chapter on this forgotten profession, ask yourself, when all else is gone, when statues fall and temples crumble, what traces of your world will remain? And who will be the clerk who quietly writes you down? Story 6, The Mogul Office of Weights and Measures, How to Standardize an Empire. It is the 17th century, and you are standing in the great marketplace of Agra. The monsoon season has just ended, and the air is thick with humidity and the scent of damp spices, cracked tamarind pods and wet stone. You hear the rhythmic clinking of bronze measuring weights being lifted, swapped, dropped, each one carefully balanced against grain, saffron, indigo, or even salt. To your left, a merchant shouts that his sear of lentils is pure, not adulterated. To your right, an officer from the Office of Weights and Measures checks scales against the official standard cubit rod. In the vast, layered bureaucracy of the Mughal Empire, there is no single coin, no universal language, no religion that binds everyone. But there is weight, there is measure, and there is a system painstakingly built to keep these things from descending into chaos. A bureau of balance in an empire of diversity. The Mughal Empire, 1526–1857, spanned modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. It encompassed hundreds of ethnic groups, dozens of major languages, and countless local customs. To unify this diversity, the Mughals relied not just on military force or monumental architecture, but on the standardization of measurement. From the weight of a silver rupee to the length of a cotton bolt, every market transaction had to be trustworthy, or risk rebellion, corruption, or famine. At the heart of this invisible order was the Office of Weights and Measures, often known by various names in Persian, such as Mizan Khana, House of Balance, or Darul Khazan, Office of the Scales. Its work was not glorious, but it was essential. Akbar's obsession with precision. The architect of this system was Emperor Akbar the Great, r. 1556–1605. A ruler known for religious tolerance and administrative brilliance, Akbar was also fascinated by numbers. In 1574, Akbar ordered a complete reformation of the imperial measurement system. Why? Because merchants in Delhi used one seer, in Gujarat it was another, Bengal used a third. Worse yet, weights were made of stone which wore down, iron which rusted, lead which deformed with heat, cowrie shells in the Far East light, fragile and easily faked. Akbar declared this disorder unacceptable for an empire that aimed to be just. So he appointed imperial inspectors and began the work of standardizing weights and measures across thousands of towns and markets. The standard weights. Under Akbar's orders, a seer was standardized at 933 grams, about 2 modern pounds. A mond was fixed at 40 seers. Subdivisions were defined by decimal fractions, a remarkably modern approach. Weights were crafted from stone and brass, stamped with the imperial seal, and sent from the central workshop to every provincial capital. These weights were considered sacred symbols of justice. Tampering with them was not just fraud, it was treason. The role of the official weighman. You, in this world, might be a government-appointed weighman called a cheladar or karar numa. Your job is to ensure every public scale adheres to the imperial standard. Your tools. A balance scale, finely calibrated. A set of nested weights, each engraved with their unit and date. A copy of the imperial edict authorizing your inspections. You move between markets, rest houses, docks, and caravans, checking whether merchants have substituted their seer with a lighter model. Sometimes you find hollowed weights filled with sand, double-bottomed baskets, rope scales hung at uneven angles. When you catch fraud, you are allowed to confiscate goods, impose fines, or refer the case to the local qazi judge. You are not loved, but you are respected and perhaps feared. The Imperial Workshop. Every few years, you return to the Imperial Center, first at Fatehpur Sikri, later at Agra or Delhi, to have your weights recertified. There, the Imperial Workshop is unlike anything you've seen. Men smelt brass in hot kilns and pour them into molds. Scribes record serial numbers on parchment scrolls. Officials compare weights to the master seer, held in a vault. The process is monotonous, but the result is an empire where a mond of wheat in Lahore weighs the same as in Dhaka. This is not a small achievement. A system of memory and trust. Standard weights were kept in every market, but few had the luxury to check them every time. So the Office of Weights and Measures also issued certificates of scale, signed by provincial officials. Merchants with clean records were allowed to display banners of certification. Others were subject to random inspections. Over time, this created an empire-wide memory of consistency. If your family had weighed goods fairly for generations, people trusted you even if they never checked the scale. But break that trust once and the system collapsed. So you, the clerk or inspector, became not only a bureaucrat, but a guardian of the invisible contract between the emperor and his people. Trade, grain, and famine. The stakes were not only economic, they were existential. In a subcontinent where famine was a recurring threat, the government often relied on granaries and rationing. The Office of Weights and Measures had to ensure that grain was delivered in the right quantity. Relief shipments were not tampered with. Rationing orders were followed. Even a 5% error in a sear of rice could mean thousands went hungry. In times of scarcity, it was your job to verify every load, every sack, every handful. You measured not just for markets, but for survival. So we ask, can an empire truly hold together by the quiet, repetitive act of weighing lentils? Or is the smallest unit the seer, the monde, the cubit the true secret to imperial control? You wake at dawn in the guest quarters of a caravanserai outside Multan. The air smells of desert dust, warmed cotton, and horse sweat. You're halfway through a provincial audit tasked by the Mogul state to inspect scales, weights, and measuring rods across key market towns in the northern frontier. The traders are already stirring. Porters yell, camels shuffle. Someone sharpens a knife against a whetstone with a rhythm you've learned to ignore. But you carry no sword, no coins, no noble title. You carry only a sealed brass weight, stamped by imperial decree, and a small leather satchel containing scrolls, record sheets, and a miniature balance scale. And yet you hold more authority than most soldiers, because you control the invisible fabric of commerce, fairness, and faith in the state. The moral measure of empire. At first glance, weighing and measuring may seem mundane, even trivial. But under the Mughal administration, especially during the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, it was imbued with deep moral significance. Fair measurement was not just practical, it was divine. In Islamic jurisprudence, the Quran commands, give full measure when you measure, and weigh with an even balance. That is the best and fairest way in the end. Surah Al-Isra, 1735. This verse became part of imperial rhetoric. Public edicts, called farmans, painted the empire's weighing officers as enforcers not only of policy, but of divine justice. To tamper with a seer or monde was not merely cheating the buyer, it was challenging moral order. Thus, your work was never just administrative. It was ethical, spiritual, foundational. The audit trail. At every market town, your routine is the same. Announce your arrival to the local magistrate, Amin or Mutazib. Visit shops, from humble grain sellers to wealthy indigo merchants. Examine scales. Are they level? Are the pans equal? Are the weights authentic? Pull out your imperial standard weight and compare. Each inspection takes 5-10 minutes, but the effect can last years. Some findings from your logbook today. In Bakar, a merchant had shaved 12 grams from his seer weight using sandpaper. In Uch, a weaver used a hollow spindle to measure cotton length, cutting customers short by 2 fingers, width. In Bahawalpur, a young trader openly bribed a local inspector to ignore warped lead weights. Your response. Reported to the regional governor, Subadar. Confiscated fraudulent tools. Marked the trader's name for exclusion from imperial contracts. You're not a judge, but your records will feed the imperial audit ledgers, which influence tax rates, merchant licenses, military provisioning estimates, Each entry becomes part of a wider bureaucratic web, stretching from village to palace. Custom and chaos. Still, the job is never clean. You encounter deep regional variation. In Bengal, measurements are often based on cowrie shells or hand spans. In Sindh, locals favor a sheaf-based system for wheat, ignoring imperial mawns. In Kashmir, a bolt of silk is measured not by cubit, but by a traditional zar, about 33 inches long. And everywhere you hear the same protest. But this is how we've always done it. You don't argue. You record both. The official measure and the local customary unit. This dual recording is policy. Akbar himself ordered that customs be preserved alongside standardization, because the empire knew too much enforcement breeds resistance, but ignorance invites chaos. Your job is to document, harmonize, never erase. You are a translator of traditions, not a destroyer of them. The hidden players, women in weighing. In most marketplaces, the face of commerce is male, but behind the scenes, women dominate textile weighing, especially in Kabul for woolen cloths, Gujarat for silk bolts and dyed muslin, Lahore for fine cotton and indigo. You visit a widow named Safia in a back alley of Agra. Her stall offers folded muslin stacked like clouds. She unrolls one for inspection. Each bolt is exactly 10 gaz yards, marked with tiny knots of dyed thread every 2 gaz. Her weights are flawless. You log it. Quietly, you think. Safia's system is more precise than many provincial auditors. But she cannot get a license to sell in the main bazaar because she is a woman. The Mughal state does not outlaw female merchants, but neither does it promote them. So Safia operates in the shadows of regulation, measured but unrecognized. You write her name in the margin of your report, nodding. No discrepancies, better than average accuracy, no license. No one will follow up. But you write it anyway. Because history, like trade, is built on boring truths no one else writes down. The dangers of disharmony. What happens when weights and measures fail? You've seen it. In 1630, famine hit western India. Grain shipments from Punjab were delayed. In some towns, tax records overstated harvests. Warehouses underweighed sacks. Port officials skimmed a handful from each measure. The cumulative result: tens of thousands starved. And the governor blamed the famine on fraud in counting and measuring. The Office of Weights and Measures responded with emergency audits. You were there. You remember measuring spoiled rice in Surat's grain houses, your boots crunching on rotting husks. You remember the faces of laborers who came too late. You remember updating the imperial registry with these words: weight mismatch recorded across 3 sub-districts. Immediate correction advised. It didn't change the past, but it may have changed the future. The following year, new copper weights were issued, and stricter audits followed. Because when measurement collapses, so does empire. Beyond Earth, astronomers and the cubit. Not all measurement is commercial. You're once summoned to the observatory at Ujjain, where imperial astronomers debate the precise length of the gaz, the royal cubit used for architectural calculations and star charts. The problem: regional masons use different cubits. 33 inches in Kashmir, 30 inches in Gujarat, 34 inches in the Deccan. Astronomers require consistency to predict eclipses, solstices, and auspicious construction dates. So you are asked to measure stars with sticks. Your team creates a marble engraving in the observatory courtyard. 1 royal gaz equals 33.75 inches, subdivided into 16 angle fingers. This becomes the new imperial construction standard adopted by Shah Jahan's architects in building the Taj Mahal. Thus, even in marble and moonlight, your boring work leaves a mark. Empire as a grid of trust. As the sun sets over the Indus Valley, you ride home with a cart of confiscated false weights. The road is quiet, and your records are complete. You reflect. The Mughal Empire is not one thing. It is many. Many languages. Many weights. Many gods. Many truths. And yet, through sheer, meticulous insistence, the office of weights and measures holds them all in delicate equilibrium. Every grain counted. Every cubit verified. Every dishonest scale exposed. You are not a merchant, nor a soldier, nor a prince. But your job, boring as it is, makes everything else possible. So we wonder, is empire measured in conquest? Or in the careful hands that weigh the millet and count the threads? What lasts longer, power or precision? The Mughal Empire no longer exists. Its emperors are buried beneath white marble domes, and the coins stamped with their names have long since been melted down, lost to time. But something strange has happened. Its weights remain. Not in museums, though a few are there, tucked behind glass with modest placards, but in the bones of the land itself. In irrigation channels that still run straight, in markets that still weigh in seers, and in the pages of dusty account books from families who don't remember who first wrote them. These remnants whisper a truth that the Mughals understood better than most. Measurement is memory. And the longer it lasts, the longer the empire does, if only in silence. The fate of the standard weights. In the centuries after the empire's peak, the official brass weights, the ones you once carried, became curiosities. Some were repurposed as paperweights by British officials, melted down during wartime shortages, buried in the walls of old merchant shops, their marks worn smooth. Others were simply passed down heirlooms kept in small boxes by families who no longer trade but remember that grandfather used to weigh grain with this. It is a slow kind of forgetting. The weight remains, but the reason behind it is gone. And yet, even without understanding, people still trust it. Because somewhere deep in the cultural body, the idea persists. A seer is a seer. A monde is a monde. The world must be weighed fairly. Weighing justice, from marketplace to courtroom. The symbolism of weights outlived their technical function. Under the Mughals, justice was often depicted as a pair of scales, a balance between mercy and law, between emperor and subject, between the measured and the measurer. When local governors issued public edicts, they used inscribed stones with engraved units of length and weight, a visible commitment to fairness. These stones weren't movable. They were meant to stay rooted, like a promise. Even today, in parts of North India and Pakistan, you can find stone rods carved into the sides of wells or mosques, wall engravings that show a standard gaz or cubit length, brass seers with Arabic script, kept not for use but for memory. These are not artifacts of war or glory. They are the quiet monuments of trust. Paper empires, the bureaucratic legacy. Let's step back and look at the machinery. The Mughal system functioned because it was written in ink, in charcoal, on parchment and palm leaf. The office of weights and measures had layers. Field auditors like yourself, roaming market towns. District scribes, who compiled reports into monthly ledgers. Provincial auditors, who created summaries for the central court. A royal commission, reporting to the Diwan finance minister and ultimately to the emperor. Each month, figures were sent to the capital. Amount of grain sold. Discrepancies found. Confiscated fake weights. Tax estimated and collected. These reports were cataloged in long imperial registers, many of which still survive, brittle and brown, in archives in Delhi, Lucknow, London. They are boring. Stunningly boring, but they offer the most complete record we have of how the empire functioned from the ground up. And you were the one who filled them in. The final audit: decline and dissolution. No system lasts forever. By the late 18th century, the Mughal Empire had fractured. Regional governors became kings. Trade routes shifted. The British East India Company, with its own obsession for measurement, introduced imperial British units. Your office still existed on paper, but its funding was cut, its officers unpaid, its authority eroded. Merchants returned to local measures. Standard weights disappeared from markets. Scales leaned again. And slowly, the system you upheld for decades faded not with a bang, but with indifference. Still, you did not stop recording. In your final report, written in fatting ink in 1803, you wrote, "No standard weights received this quarter. Measures locally made. Accuracy uncertain." It was the quiet obituary of an idea. The echo in modern India and Pakistan. Yet history does not vanish. The systems you built, your seer, your gas, your record books, migrated forward into new regimes. When the British formalized the Indian revenue and trade systems, they borrowed Mughal units, codifying them in English-led surveys. When independent India and Pakistan emerged, both nations began with these same inherited standards, modifying only later to metric units. Even now, in small bazaars across South Asia, shoppers still say, "Give me 1 seer of rice." They no longer mean exactly 933 grams, but they mean something close enough. The memory lingers like a shadow on the scales. You were never remembered. No street is named after you. No chronicle records your name. You did not lead an army. You did not write poetry. You didn't build a palace. But your daily, tedious, often thankless work created the conditions for all those things to exist. You were a civil servant, a measurer, a keeper of scale and truth. And that may be one of the most human jobs in history. Because long after empires fall, people still need to know. How much? How long? Is this fair? And someone must answer with a weight in one hand, a ledger in the other.